We are starting a new sermon series today, a series where we are going to spend 8 weeks going through the entire Gospel of John. We're not going to look at it verse by verse or chapter by chapter. That would take us, from now until Jesus returns. But what we are going to do is look at John's Gospel by touching on 7 important moments. Those are the 7 I am statements of Jesus. You're probably familiar with some of them. Jesus says things like, I am the bread of life. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection and the life. And we're going to move through 7 of those over the next 8 weeks. But today, I want to start us off with an introduction to John's Gospel. One of the challenges that we have in today's world is that we can read stuff and people try to hide their biases. Let me give you an example. Amidst this COVID crisis, you can find legitimate, credible, so-called news sources that will substantiate whatever your position is when you start into looking. So if you're someone who says, I think that we should remain frozen in place much, much, much longer, you can find news sources and articles that will substantiate that with facts, right? Because they're biased. Equally, if you're someone who says we need to return back and open things for the sake of the economy and it's time, you can find news sources that are going to substantiate that with facts. And the reason is, in our world today, everyone tries to hide their bias and cloak their purpose in writing. Not so with John. John sets it right out front at the end of his gospel, but he does not try to hide it. He tells us specifically why he has written the things he's written and what purpose he's trying to accomplish. Listen to it. Chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. John says, Now Jesus did many other things in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these were written, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you might have life in his name. I want to look just briefly at a couple of points from this. The first one is, John says that the things that he captures here in his gospel, in the life of Jesus, are not an unbiased historical account, as though such thing existed. Instead, John is saying, I wrote down these signs that Jesus has done. Now, signs is the technical word that John uses in his gospel for the miracles that Jesus performs. Signs is a very helpful way to think of these when you're reading John's gospel. What John is saying is when Jesus performs these miracles, they are not ends in themselves. They are like signs that point to a deeper truth or a deeper reality. When we read the gospel accounts, we can sort of get caught up in these miraculous events that Jesus does and these things that he works. We ask questions of nature and natural law, and we ask questions of, how is this so wonderful and fantastic? Because we fixate on the miracles themselves. But what John is saying is when you read my gospel, when you read the accounts that I've written down, I want you to see these things as signs. Signs that are not ends in themselves, but signs that point to a deeper reality. That's how signs work. You actually fixate on the sign itself to your own peril. Imagine if you're driving a car and you're driving along at 80 kilometers an hour down a windy road, and there's a yellow sign to the side of the road that says extreme curves ahead, right? Well, if you fixate only on that sign and you're driving and you're staring at that sign and you're looking at it as an end unto itself, you're going to crash your car and drive right off the road because you missed the point of the sign. The sign's purpose was not so that you would stare at the sign, it's so that it would tell you something that's true that's about to happen or coming. And that's what John wants you to know about these accounts that he's chosen. They are signs. They're signs that point you to a reality. Verse 30, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Verse 31, he then goes on and says, But I chose to record these signs for a purpose. And the purpose was so that you might believe. Now that's not only John's bias and his purpose in writing the gospel, but that's our purpose in spending 8 weeks in this gospel, that you would believe. It's interesting because the commentaries on this suggest that John might have belief in mind as something, that is a completed act, or as maybe it's something in the present. It's sort of unclear, but I would suggest that it's both, and that is particularly helpful for us today. If you're someone who says, well, I've never come to a place of personal belief in Jesus, John has arranged these so that you may come to belief. If you're someone who says, well, I believe in Jesus, but I'm really struggling these days. I'm struggling to keep my faith in the face of all the hardship that I see and the suffering around me. Well, John writes these accounts, these signs, so that you will remain faithful, so that you will persevere in your faith in Jesus, so you'll keep on believing. That's why John arranges these, so that you will believe and so that you will keep on believing. And friends, if you're watching this morning and you are reading this account from John's gospel, and you are a nominal Christian, nominal meaning a Christian by name only, John wants you to know that these signs are going to point you to a deep truth in Jesus that will actually change everything. Belief is an important word in John's gospel. You see it here in verse 31, but you also see it 98 times throughout his gospel. And theology is not a science of numbers, but it's interesting because it shows you where John's emphasis lies, right? And it's particularly interesting because the word belief only occurs 11 times in Matthew's gospel, 10 times in Mark, and 9 times in Luke. And so John is driving towards something incredibly important. He's saying that when you come to Jesus, belief is playing for all the marbles. It's really important to believe and to remain faithful. So what does belief mean? Well, we have to pause for a moment and think about that. Some people, I think, find that belief is like a mental tick box. Say, well, sure, I believe it's going to be sunny tomorrow. I believe that I'm going to have lunch in a little while, and I believe that Jesus is who he says he was, right? It's just this passive belief that doesn't shape anything. Well, that's not what John has in mind. Let me do a thought experiment with you for a moment. I want you to imagine that you're having a conversation with the devil, with Satan. And you asked him, you said, do you believe that Jesus existed? He'd say, well, of course I do. He said, well, do you believe that he was born of a virgin? He said, well, sure he was. Do you believe that he lived a perfect, sinless life? Satan would say, sure, believe that. He said, well, do you believe that Jesus paid for the price and penalty of the sins of his people? Well, Satan would say, well, sure, I believe that. Of course I believe that. Well, do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? Well, sure, I believe that. Do you believe Jesus is the Messiah? Satan would say, of course I believe that. And that exposes that a simple assent, mental assent or belief, is not saving faith. Where Satan's belief falls short is that it has in no way shaped his life. What John's driving at here is a belief that goes beyond simply affirming things to be true and living as though it's entirely true in your life. In fact, I want to push it even further. In this conversation with the devil, the tipping point is not whether or not he believes things to be true about Jesus, but whether or not Jesus is his life. And the same is true for us today. Is Jesus your life? Personally, my journey through this COVID crisis has been a bit of a societal truth serum. It has exposed a lot of false stories that I tell myself and that we as a society live out of. It's forced us to really get right down to the brass tacks of what actually matters. What do we truly value? And in one sense, this COVID crisis has invited us and forced us to ask the question, what is my life? What is it based on? Where do I turn to? What is the irreducible minimum that makes me Ray David? Is it, I used to think that it was my hobbies. I used to think, man, if I surf and mountain bike, if I, do all these fun, well, those things are my life, or at least partly, but those things are gone. I can't do them right now. So what is my life? Well, maybe you say, well, my life is my career. That's how I define myself. Well, your career is entirely changed now. You're working from home and things are completely different. And many face unemployment as a result of this. Was that truly your life? You see, friends, if you are going to have a life that endures and matters, it must be built on something strong enough to endure the hardship. What you need is a rock big enough, an anchor heavy enough. You need an irreducible minimum that will stand come what may. And that's what it means to believe in Jesus, to say, Jesus is my life. No matter what happens, when everything else is stripped away, Jesus is still enough. That's the kind of belief that John is driving towards. It's the kind of belief that Satan doesn't have. It's the kind of belief that nominal Christians don't have. But John says, these signs I have written so that you might believe. So that you might believe. John has chosen these signs in his gospel so that we will believe. So that we will believe in a way that allows us and forces us to build our life upon Jesus. Verse 31, the first part, he says, but these were written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. See, what John also wants you to know is that there are two distinct things that come with this kind of life-altering belief in Jesus. The first one is the content of that belief. John says, when you look at the signs that I record in my Gospels, you can come to belief that Jesus is two distinct things that we often conflate and put together, okay? The first one that he wants you to believe is that Jesus is the Christ. See that in the text? So that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ. Well, that's another way of saying the Messiah, God's chosen one. John wants you to know that when you read these accounts of Jesus, that Jesus is the embodiment of God's deliverer that he provides for his people. In other words, he is our Lord. That's how you come to a place where Jesus is one that you believe in and can build your life on, trusting him as your Lord. And secondly, he says, not only to believe that he is your Lord, but to believe that he is the Son of God, that he is divine. Well, that's truly a tipping point for so many of us in our world today. That's what defines Christian faith. You can believe everything else to be true about Christian faith and not be a Christian. You could believe all of these other things and be Muslim. The tipping point to Christian faith, to belief in the sort of way that John is inviting in his gospel, is when you believe that Jesus is the Christ and the Son of God. To look to Jesus and see God fully revealed. He is the Christ and the Son of God. This belief has content, but this belief also has a purpose. And that purpose you see in the tail end of our verse today. He says, so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. See, John has chosen to arrange these signs in his gospel, not just so that you and I would come to belief as an end in itself, but so that in believing that Jesus is both Christ and God, we would have life in his name, life that is bountiful today and life that endures beyond the grave. That's the end result of the kind of belief that John is driving towards. An unshakable life, an unflappable existence. That's the kind of life that is lived in Christ. That's what belief truly means. Now, if you go back just a little bit in our reading, you'll see that John doesn't just leave it abstract. Instead, he gives us an example. Immediately before this, you see the account of the resurrected Jesus interacting with Thomas. And I think Thomas is a picture for all of us, because Thomas is someone that we are told a few verses before, he heard from his friends about Jesus being raised from the dead. He heard it. And he was like, yeah, unless I see it for myself. And perhaps you might not be quite so stark or so honest about your belief in Jesus, but in different ways and to different degrees, you are holding Jesus at arm's length. You're saying, well, I guess, I suppose, I've heard the good news. I'm a Christian by name because I hang out with the other disciples, but unless I actually see it and touch it, I'm not going to believe. The good news for you today is that Jesus came to Thomas. Jesus didn't abandon him or leave him alone in his doubt. Maybe that's for you today. You find yourself in this place of doubt and questioning, and just in the same way that Jesus came to Thomas, he will come to you. Thomas touches his side, looks at his hands, puts his finger in the holes, and Thomas looks at him and says the two things that John said we needed to believe. He says, my Lord and my God. He believed that Jesus was both the Christ, the Messiah, the Lord, and divine. And then Thomas goes on, church history tells us that he went on to give his entire life to spreading the news of the truth of Jesus, to bring other people to that same kind of belief. He invested his entire life in it. It was totally shaped by that. He even did that to the point of death. He died a martyr's death because he was not willing to recant. He knew what he had seen. He knew that Jesus was truly the Messiah, the Christ, and the Son of God. Now, I think it's also telling that Thomas doesn't come to faith by seeing Jesus gloriously ascended and in radiant light. The thing that brings Thomas to a place of converted belief where his life is now built on Jesus was actually beholding the wounds in his side. Thomas is in a place of suffering. His best friend, all of his hopes, everything had just been shattered on Good Friday. He's absolutely devastated. And when Christ appears to him in that place of doubt and questioning and pain and hurt, Jesus exposes the wounds that he bears in his own body. And that's what causes Thomas to believe. You know, today during this COVID crisis, you might be bearing a lot of wounds yourself. Challenges in your home, challenges in your family, worry and concern about your future and how this is all going to work out. And it's causing you to doubt and question. Just pray. Allow Jesus to come to you. Look to him. Behold the wounds that he bears. And allow him to give you the gift of faith and belief. This next 8-week series is going to try to look at these 7 I am statements of Jesus, these truths that Jesus speaks about himself, and invite us to begin to gain a fulsome picture from these different nuances and angles. But as we move through these 7, always keep in mind the purpose. We are looking at these signs so that we might believe that Jesus is the Son of God and the Messiah, the Christ. And in believing, have life in his name.